The lights on the stage dimmed slowly, as if the theater itself were holding its breath. In the shadows behind the curtain, Alan Rickman stood silently, fingers curled slightly against the cool wood of the set wall. He was not rehearsing lines that night. No director barked orders. There was no camera rolling. And yet, it was perhaps the most important role of his life. No one knew what he was carrying. To the world, Alan was the velvet-voiced master of gravitas and wit. Professor Snape. The villain Hans Gruber. The tortured romantic in Truly, Madly, Deeply. A man who never broke character, never dropped the mask. But off-stage, away from the lens, a quieter battle raged, one that he refused to make public. In August of 2015, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a terminal illness that tears through the body like fire in dry leaves. And yet, he told almost no one. Not even most of his co-stars knew. He kept filming. He kept smiling. He kept returning to the stage with a kind of grace only those who've known mortality intimately can muster. Alan Rickman was dying, and yet he chose to keep showing up, not just for work, but for everyone else. It all started in a quiet hospital room, where a doctor in a pressed white coat gave him the words that don't just end conversations, they fracture worlds. "You have 6 months." There was a pause. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Alan simply nodded. Not with fear. Not with denial. But with acceptance, and something else. Resolve. He had always believed in the power of art, of storytelling, of kindness done quietly and consistently. If this was to be his last chapter, he would write it on his own terms. He left the hospital and went straight to a cafe. He sat down, ordered a black coffee, and took out a small notebook he carried everywhere. The waiter would later say there was something unshakably calm about him, like a man who had already made peace with whatever ghosts waited beyond the curtain. In the months that followed, Alan did what Alan always did, he listened more than he spoke, observed with the intensity of a poet, and worked like someone with forever ahead of him. He narrated a documentary about the future of the arts. He wrote letters, long, beautiful letters, to people who had mattered to him, some of whom he hadn't spoken to in years. He said things most leave unsaid until it's too late. He mended quiet fractures, forgave old friends, and even reached out to a student director who'd once sent him a script and never got a reply. "Your film was brave," he wrote in ink that trembled slightly. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." On set, during the final post-production stages of Alice Through the Looking Glass, Alan Rickman once paused mid-recording. He looked through the studio glass at the sound engineer and simply said, "Let's take a minute." Not because he was in pain, though he was. But because he'd spotted a photo of a young girl on the engineer's desk, his daughter. "She looks like she tells you stories before bed," Alan said when he returned. The engineer smiled, surprised. "She does, actually." Alan nodded and chuckled softly. That's where it all begins. He waited until the end to tell the world. Not because he was afraid of sympathy, or too proud to be seen fragile, but because he didn't want the attention to shift. He didn't want headlines to read, "Alan Rickman's Final Days." He wanted the attention to stay where it always had, in the craft. In the story. In the moment between silence and applause. It wasn't ego. It was humility in its purest form. Even Emma Thompson, one of his dearest friends, said she was half-blind with rage when she found out how long he had kept the truth from her. But she understood. They all did. He wanted his final role to be a gift, not a goodbye. On January 14, 2016, the world found out what Alan had been carrying. The shock rippled across generations. Fans, actors, directors, young kids who'd grown up watching him teach potions at Hogwarts, none of them saw it coming. And maybe that was the point. He didn't want to be remembered for the waiting, but for what he did while he waited. He filled those final months with deliberate grace. Not just in front of cameras, but in the smallest acts, a warm word to a stagehand, a handwritten note to a fan, a brief pause to notice something beautiful, like a girl who tells her father bedtime stories. The truth is, Alan Rickman didn't wait to die. He waited to be remembered as he lived, with dignity, purpose, and generosity. And when the end finally came, he exited not with a dramatic monologue or spotlight fanfare, but with the stillness of a man who had said everything that mattered, done what he could, and left no role unfinished. The final line he wrote in his journal read, "If only life could be a little more tender and art a little more robust." It was not a wish. It was a mission. A final cue. And Alan Rickman, always the consummate actor, never missed a cue.